Thank you, Meg. It's wonderful to see you again. And I definitely need to update my bio because I think that's a good one, but it's a little rusty now. So also Frida went to Dartmouth too. So but we met afterwards in New York, where she also became a great mentor of mine as we were developing PowerToFly. And you've since sold Pymetrics to Harver now, excuse me, not to be confused with your other alma mater, Harvard, where you are working there as one of their executives, but also really focus on this idea around AI ethics, right? And so what I would love to get into a little bit first is, what was your journey to being a leader in the AI space? And then we can go into what actually means to be an AI ethicist for those of us who are still trying to wrap our arms around the basics of AI.
Totally. Yeah. Happy to chat through that. So again, my founder story is I was a, really excited scientist who then ultimately found that bench science didn't have as much real world application as I was kind of hoping for. Went to HBS, started Pymetrics because, saw the challenges with recruiting, thought that we had a solution that could fix it. And really, I think at the end of the day, I think we were very new to the field of AI. Like if you think of AI, 10 years ago, which is when we started Pymetrics, it really wasn't that much of a thing, if it was a thing at all. And so we really kind of like watched the space evolve over the last 10 years. And now I feel like there's so many buzzwords, and it's hard to keep track of, what is and was not happening in AI. I always like to say AI is like teenage sex. Like everyone says, they're having it or they're doing it, but nobody really knows what it means. And then somebody added to that, yes, and it usually turns out to be disastrous once you have it, which, that's an added punchline that I'm not sure.
Well, I have a third to that, which actually I think this might have been like a Reese Witherspoon line or something from Big Little Lies, where she said, nobody's ever proud of losing their virginity, like
right.
at an early age, like So
anyway,
same way with AI. Anyway, we're going down the tunnel.
Bottom line, I think there's, AI is everywhere, but also highly confusing. People use it to mean very different things. Some people think AI and machine learning are interchangeable, other people don't. I mean, so, I think we've seen all of that evolve over the last 10 years. And, with the advent of ChatGPT, just in this last, 6 months, I think that now truly the layperson has become fascinated by AI in a way that I hadn't even seen before that. Right. So I think so then what does it mean to develop ethical AI? I mean, quite frankly, I think it's as confusing as the field of AI itself, because, ethics are very, ethics is a space in general where there remains a lot of, disagreement, basically. I mean, if you try to define, what is ethical and what is not ethical, people will come up with very different definitions. People can generally agree to certain principles, but then once you try to put these principles in practice, I think that's when it becomes very challenging, right? So general principles include, sort of data privacy, lack of bias, explainability, et cetera, et cetera. But then when you actually start to, ask people, okay, well, what does this mean for your development of your AI? That's when I think things become a lot more confusing. And so, I think I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are no clear-cut answers, unfortunately. Everyone just wants to know, okay, well, how can I do it and what should I be doing, right? And the answer is really, it's quite complicated. I think some broad themes, that we've seen emerge are that people, I think, are becoming a little tired of sort of these sort of grand pronouncements, working groups, sort of voluntary frameworks. There's a lot of these voluntary frameworks around. They all kind of coalesce around the same thing. But if the challenge is then, sort of putting those into practice, then they sort of lose their appeal. So I think there is more and more regulation that's coming down the pike. So, New York City passed, first in the nation regulation around algorithms. It's the New York City bias audit law. The rules were just finalized last week, and it's going to effect in July. So happy to chat through that. That's
Yeah.
a pretty constrained law, but still was a 4-year work in progress, which was interesting to have a front seat to. Everything from that to the EU is working on the AI Act, the AIA as it's known, which is much, much broader in scope. And I mean, obviously, we're talking about a city, granted a large city versus a European Union. And so I think, and everything in between. I mean, there are pending bills in, California, DC, New Jersey, all around this question of bias, which is, something that media, and the general public are quite concerned about. And then, I think there's increasing interest, at the national level, et cetera, not as much in the US, but elsewhere, to have sort of these broader frameworks in place. But again, I mean, my personal take is it's going to be another, I mean, I don't mean to sound, pessimistic, but another 5 to 10 years before we really have some of this stuff figured out, because it's very complicated, very differing opinions, a lot of challenges with actual implementation, a lot of lack of will, and outright resistance when some of these things come to pass from, some of the more traditional players. Like big tech isn't particularly excited about a lot of this regulation. So I'd say it's going to be bumpy waters, for quite a while to come. And I think ChatGPT just kind of, put some massive accelerant on all of that. And it's going to, be even more choppy because, I mean, the open letter from, I can't remember, hundreds of, if not thousands of scientists, basically, or scientist practitioners saying like, hey, we need a moratorium. I mean, I tend to agree with that, but, that's just the beginning, I think, salvo and what will, likely be a very turbulent period, I think, with ChatGPT.
Yeah. Well, I think back to our earlier analogies too, it's like everybody wants to be first. But what is the benefit of being first? I mean, I guess it's market share at this stage. But if there is going to be regulation, then.
Well, I mean, I think again, I think many folks are engaged, have some form of machine learning or AI. And now with the advent of ChatGPT, I think it will be almost no one that won't introduce, some form of it unless something changes, right? So it is going to become, pretty ubiquitous in my mind, right? So now it's definitely, everybody is quote unquote having teenage sex. But, I think then the barrier to trying to understand if it's being used in a quote unquote ethical way or not is much higher. And, it just becomes quite challenging. Yeah.
So tell me about your work around the New York law, because I have some of your remarks here.
Yeah. I mean, you can read those, or I can just I mean, look, I think that like, so the whole New York law happened because, city council, members of city council were growing increasingly concerned around bias and automation. And they had, sort of this New York City had been working on a broader sort of oversight of the city's use of automation prior to this law being introduced. And then sort of, this was kind of a perfect time to think about a more narrowed scope, looking primarily at hiring algorithms, right? And, the concern was, and it was exacerbated by COVID, how are these inequalities that already exist in our hiring systems being automated and therefore, scaled even further, right? So we were, basically provided, sort of scientific advice, guidance, whatever you want to call it, in terms of us and many others. I mean, we were one of a handful of folks that were really pretty strongly advising or, sort of helping with the language, et cetera, et cetera. And, the passage of the law took, 2 years, 3 years. It was quite a while. And then, the administration changed. It went from de Blasio to Mayor Adams. So the implementation then, the actual rulemaking process basically took another 1.5 years, which is, not trivial if you think about kind of like, and, it was really interesting because it's a microcosm, I think, of what the challenges of AI regulation will present more broadly, right? In the sense that even among folks that want regulation, there is a wide range of what people are looking for, right? And I think we were on the kind of more moderate end. I think there's folks that wanted this thing to be way more, comprehensive. This law really only covers race and gender. People wanted to add in disability. They wanted to add in age. I mean, they wanted to have it audit way beyond just bias and et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of like, on the one hand, let's call it, the progressive, faction. And then on the business side, there were folks, clients of ours that were okay on board with this and saying, yes, this is good. We don't want to be using algorithms if they're biased, all the way to like people that were like, this is terrible. It's anti-business. You're going to ruin New York City. You're going to make it business unfriendly, et cetera. And so it was literally like, scale from 0 to 100 was fully covered in this process, right? And I think what you ended up getting, and it was, quite a struggle, I think, was something that's, fairly moderate. I think in the actual rulemaking process got cut down considerably in terms of like what it was initially intended to cover to what it covers now. Although, we'll see in practice, right? Because again, it's the burden is on the employer. What you have, so what is the New York City bias law? Basically, what it asks you to do is if you're using an automated hiring tool, you have to provide on a public facing website, this is kind of the novelty of the whole thing, guidance around how much racial and or ethnic bias racial and or ethnic bias and gender bias you have in your hiring tools. These types of analyses, so basically if you had no bias, the number would be 1, right? So if you're, basically passing the same number of men and women and you're calculating a fraction, the number is 1. Let's say you're passing only 80% of women for every 100% of men, then the fraction is 0.8. And then you can obviously go all the way down to 0. So the closer you are to 1, the better. And there's sort of this legal cutoff of 0.8, which, has been on the books now for 50 years. You now need to publish that on your website for any hiring tool that you're using. Now you can imagine that's causing a lot of angst among people, because let's say I've been using a tool that doesn't do that well with women, and I'm only hiring 50% of the women that are applying compared to 100% of the men, and my ratio is 0.5, and now I got to put this on this website for the whole world to see. You can imagine that causes a lot of angst, right? Which was really the thinking behind the law, which is like, hey, if you're going to use these tools, then at least like let the general public know that you're using them. And oh, by the way, if now you have to publicly showcase this, maybe you'll move to something that's, a little better, right? So there is a lot of angst. I think it hopefully will be pushing companies to really looking at what are we doing? Are we using the least biased tool around, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the broadest win that I think we should all be proud of is this is providing some sort of an understanding of what ground truth is. Because right now discussions around bias are completely devoid of any kind of facts, not because people don't want there to be facts. They just don't exist. It's sort of like air pollution before we had any kind of like meters actually measuring air quality. It's like, I think the air is polluted, but I have no idea, right? So at a bare minimum, it's a maybe small step forward towards understanding, okay, what does it even mean? What does bias in the industry even look like, right? Are we talking about this or that, right? So again, it was a huge win, I think. Lots more work to be done, tremendous amount more work to be done. But I think at a bare minimum, it's kind of a stake in the ground for let's try to start measuring this in a sort of, sort of a more standardized way, so that at least we can start talking apples to apples. So.
Now, this is fascinating. You're saying it's going into effect in June, right?
July, I think July 5th.
Okay,
Yep.
so, and then there'll obviously be penalties for companies that are not adhering to the law. 2 questions around implementation that I have.
Yep.
One, what are the tools that
are covered?
Transparent about?
Yeah.
And then the second is, who are the regulators? Like, who do you go to? Like, is there a whole industry sort of popping up around this? To measure your tool?
Yeah. So, well, let me start with the first question. So when the law was first written, it was a pretty broad definition, and in the scoping of the law, right, and the implementation of it, that's when it kind of got reduced. So I won't bore you with the technicalities, but it's basically you have to be using, some not even sophisticated is the wrong word, but you have to be doing certain things with your math to be included, right? So if you're just using some sort of more basic tools, you're not included, versus if you're doing sort of more sophisticated analyses, you are included. Now, people have argued, and rightly so, that basic tools can have just as much bias as more sophisticated ones. So this arbitrary cutoff, and there was a lot of public testimony around this of like, Why are we, only including the more sophisticated, like, for example, they had something called cross-validation in there. Why are we only including cross-validated tools? They removed that, but there's other sort of arbitrary, definitions that were included, and a lot of folks were saying, this really doesn't make any sense, because if your basic tool, it's sort of like saying, well, electric cars and regular engines have to be audited, but diesel, engines don't. Well, why are we excluding diesel engines? Just because they're old, that doesn't mean they're any less biased. So that, I think, is a big miss, quite frankly, of the regulation. And then it has to be used in a certain manner, right? So sourcing algorithms, for example, if you're just presenting candidates to companies, those are not included as an example. But if you're using them in any decision-making capacity, then it's much more likely that you will need to provide a report. But quite frankly, I think the interesting, we'll know, July 5th, what different parties think in terms of who needs to be included. Because again, ultimately, it's a legal matter. Ultimately, the responsibility is on the employer, and each employer needs to make their own decision as to whether they think their tool, by this definition, should be included. Does that make sense? And we, as the vendor, have the obligation, obviously, to provide, assistance, essentially, but it's an employer decision that they need to make individually. In terms of who's going to regulate, so the Department of Worker and Consumer Protection, DCWP, I believe, is the ultimate agency responsible for this. They were certainly the ones promulgating the rules, although maybe it's going to a different agency, so don't quote me on that. But the requirement in this law is that there be an independent auditor, a third-party auditor, and that actually received a lot of pushback from big tech and sort of big business, and they were quite concerned, but that remained, which I think is a good thing. They were pushing for like an internal auditor, right? Well, it's like, the fox guarding the hen house. There has been a crop of companies, and it was actually quite funny, having been involved in this from the beginning, to start getting emails last year from all these companies being like, have you thought about the New York City bias law and how you're going to comply with it? And I was like, I have thought about that law, actually, and I have thought about it to comply with it. But so, we've chosen two folks that we're going to work with, one who's going to certify the audit, and the other one's going to do more of the technical components. Company called Truera is going to be doing more of the technical components, and third-party auditor named Babel AI is going to be doing the certification. Great folks. If people haven't selected their providers yet, but yeah, I mean, there is a whole crop of sort of auditing, compliance, governance, whatever you want to call them, companies that have come to be, not just because of New York City, but because of the EU and lots of other places. And again, I think that's a good thing. Now, obviously, that was another big piece of criticism around this bill, was like, it's a nascent industry, there's no standards in AI auditing. People don't know what they're doing. It could be fraudulent. I mean, on and on and on, all of which are true, right? I mean, after all, we had Enron, right? And their accountants, and that was fully fraudulent. And that was an auditing, auditing fraud. So, I mean, just because the industry is new and et cetera, doesn't, that's not going to make it more or less likely to be spurious. But so, of course, all those criticisms are true. And I also think, and like big companies, like I think Deloitte has actually been considering kind of moving into this space as well. So it definitely will create an industry around it. And there's lots more of this regulation that appears to be kind of coming down the pike, so.
Yeah. And ultimately, how helpful do you think it will be? You talked about evening the playing field, like understanding, just actually getting like the base numbers, but do you think it's just
I think it's going to look, I'm an optimist, right? An impatient optimist, no less. We need something. Is this perfect? Is this, if I can wave a magic wand, exactly what I would have? No. It has a lot of flaws. However, I think it's absolutely a step in a very, very important direction, right? And I think we have to start somewhere. I think, perfect is the enemy of the good, right? And so, again, I'm just going to restate why I think it's important, because these ratios that I talked about that can range from 0 to 1, they are already being calculated. Federal law basically mandates that people that are using these tools calculate these ratios. They're called impact ratios, disparate impact ratios, adverse impact ratios. So they're not new, right? They're absolutely not new. What is new is that they're going to be stuck like a product label on somebody's website for the world to see. Right now, they are supposed to be calculated. So in this case, it's making it mandatory. So that's a good step. But the biggest difference, I think, is that even when they're calculated now, they're basically hidden, like amongst sort of legal documents, right? Like when we started working with clients, like sometimes you wouldn't get the ratios that your own tool was creating because they were considered so sensitive, right? They're like sensitive legal material. So I think the fact that some subset of these, companies are going to have to put this on their website is actually a huge win, right? For the public, for them, and for the industry, because I think the biggest reason I think this is a win for the overall industry, and I've said this many times, and I'm sure there's lots of people who disagree with me, but I will stick to my tune. We can't expect people to have trust in technology if we don't make it transparent. Like, I think it's so basic that it's like, my 6-year-old can understand this. However, unfortunately, there seems to be this continued pattern of like, oh, we're trustworthy, we're building trustworthy AI. Oh, you want us to prove it? Well, sorry, we can't do that, or we're not interested, or we don't want regulation, or we can do it ourselves. Those two things are completely incompatible. And so I think if you want the tech industry to be a trustworthy industry that people can rely on and not fear and worry that it's, et cetera, et cetera, I think you need to start being a lot more transparent. And so it's a step in that direction. It's definitely not the be all end all. And I'm sure, again, I just told you, it's going to take 10 years to sort a lot of the stuff out. It's probably going to take 10 years to sort a lot of this stuff out. But prior to us having the Clean Air Protection Act of 1970 or whatever it was that basically mandated pollution standards, we had literally a 10-year study of air quality, right? This isn't that, but it's a beginning point, right? It's starting to, we need to study how bad this bias problem is. And I, from what I know, think it's pretty bad. But again, my sampling of the data is very sparse and kind of idiosyncratic, right? Not from what we've done, but what we've seen, prior to us coming in.
Yeah.
And so we need some standardization around that. So it's a step in the right direction.
Well, and you said that it's so hard to get this information already, even out of your own clients. I mean, I've been there a million times. I can never even get any of the data that please pay us this money and
Exactly.
else, and then they will refuse to actually
Totally
help us complete the picture. Question from the audience on balancing the potential benefits of AI with the need to protect privacy and personal data. My understanding of this is that it's anonymized data, right?
Yes. Again, and I mean, like, again, we're not even touching on privacy right now, right? This is all around issues of bias. Then there's the whole other issue of privacy, right? And so, at Pymetrics, and, we continue this even after the sale to Harver, we have the perspective that your data is your data. You as a user, if you go through Pymetrics, own your data, and you can delete it at any time, et cetera, right? So that's our position. As people I'm sure well know, that's one position, and then it's everything all the way to the other extreme, right? So absolutely, I think, we need to protect data privacy. But again, I think, when you get into the weeds of how easy is that and what are the legal implications, et cetera, it just becomes a lot more challenging. And so, it's harder to do the right thing, quote unquote, than you might think. We did it, but it wasn't without, some headaches. So.
Yeah, I know that. Great. Well, what are you working on at Harvard right now?
I mean, look, it's exciting times, right? Because I think just having, so it's a much larger platform. Being their chief data science officer, I think you get to touch a lot more things, which is great. Sort of the design principles remain the same, which is that, we put, data privacy and, lack of bias and all these other sort of really important principles kind of at the forefront of everything that we're doing. And, we just have, we went from like, I won't even tell you how many more clients we have now than we used to have. So we're obviously touching a lot more people, and that's, just very exciting. And also I just think, having been doing this now for 10 years, I think, hopefully you can provide some guidance on, what does work, what doesn't work, because I think for better or worse, I think when we came to this field, we were a bit naive, which, a lot of people are when they first start something. And I think a lot of folks that are providing guidance on how AI should be built, or, all of, these types of matters, a lot of times either they're kind of standing, 100 feet away in an ivory tower or some capacity where they're not really kind of in the weeds building, or, they've been in the industry or in there, for so long that they've kind of, calcified into this position of like, sort of entrenched in their position that like whatever they're doing is right, and, they can't be improved, and no, we don't want to share our data. So we need to have something in the middle where you're not kind of like, sort of slinging arrows from way up high without really any understanding of what's going on, right? Sort of this ivory tower criticism versus, sort of entrenched business interests that are not even remotely interested in like, hey, how could we be doing things better? So hopefully, I think, PowerToFly, Harver, Pymetrics, we're small enough that we can be more of that nimble intermediate business entity that is not, again, calcifying things that are maybe not ideal, but yet at the same time know enough about what's actually happening and possible in the field that we're providing realistic solutions. So that's what I'm excited to do, at Harver and beyond. So
You just gave me an idea for our next webinar.
I'm glad, and providing ideas for people's next webinars. That's what I'm doing. So
yes. No, I mean, I would get something
free advice. I'm doing all sorts of stuff.
There's lots of free advice.
Exactly. So
great. So you think California is going to be next? EU is going to be next?
The EU will definitely be next. What happens in California, DC, and New Jersey, it's interesting. Like, who knows? And I will personally be super interested in that and kind of seeing, kind of how that whole space falls. But again, I wouldn't even limit it to those 3 jurisdictions, right? I think there's going to be a lot of stuff that happens in a lot of different places, especially because I think ChatGPT, without saying who, one of the auditors that we know, once the whole ChatGPT thing came out, he's like, I think I'm just going to go and start herding sheep, meaning I just want to go so far away from the tech world because it's just becoming such a disaster that's what I want to do. Yeah. Again, I don't think we're there yet, but it's going to touch, ChatGPT really means that AI is now going to touch almost everybody, and in a way that could have some, very serious implications. So I think we're going to see more, not less of sort of, regulatory oversight.
All right. Well, we are at time.
Yeah. Well, thanks for this. This is exciting.
Thank you. I have more questions now, so I will.
There you go. There you go. For when I see you next. So.
All right. Thank you so much, Frida.
All right. Perfect. Thanks, guys.
Bye. Thank you both to KZ and Frida. That was a wonderful chat to get to sit through. Cannot wait to see what upcoming chat sessions are birthed out of this. So thank you both so much.